They said it was impossible. For a decade, the world's most powerful militaries watched from the sidelines as one of Africa's deadliest terrorist networks controlled vast territories across the Sahel. Untouchable, unpunished, unstoppable. Then, on one morning in Mali, everything changed. A single drone strike, one precision operation, and suddenly, the entire command structure of JNIM, years of operational planning, decades of accumulated power, was obliterated in seconds. The commander was dead. The base was ash. But here's what Western media refuses to tell you. This wasn't American firepower. This wasn't French intervention. This was Africa fighting back. And they just proved the entire international security establishment fundamentally wrong about what they're actually capable of. What you're about to witness will change how you see African militaries forever. Western media portrayed Mali's military takeover as a disaster. But what if everything you've been told about what's happening in the Sahel is built on incomplete or outright false information? Over the past few years, something unprecedented has been unfolding across West Africa. It's a transformation so dramatic that it's reshaping the balance of power in one of the world's most strategically contested regions. Yet most international news outlets have barely covered it. Those that have seemed determined to frame it through a predetermined lens that obscures a far more complex reality. The emergence of an African military alliance that's not asking for permission, rejecting foreign intervention, and, against overwhelming odds, actually winning. This is the story of the Sahel's reclamation of sovereignty. And to understand it, you need to first understand what the world has been missing. For decades, the narrative surrounding Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger was remarkably consistent. These countries were portrayed as failing states, incapable of defending themselves, drowning in insurgency, and desperately in need of Western military guidance and support. The media echoed this story relentlessly. International institutions reinforced it. Even well-meaning observers accepted it as fact. But starting around 2021, something began to shift. Not in the ground situation alone, though the military situation did shift dramatically, but in the fundamental question of who would control the future of these nations. Here's where things get interesting. The catalyst wasn't foreign aid or international intervention. It was the rejection of both. In 2021, Mali's military conducted a coup. Within months, they had moved to expel French military forces that had been embedded in the country for nearly a decade. This wasn't a minor policy adjustment. France had positioned itself as the indispensable security partner across the region. French troops flew surveillance missions. French forces conducted operations. French military command structures had become woven into local power structures. And now, suddenly, they were being asked to leave. What happened next changed everything. Rather than descending into isolation or military collapse, as many Western analysts confidently predicted, Mali pivoted. It began a rapid military modernization program. It deepened ties with Russia. It formed an unprecedented regional alliance with Burkina Faso and Niger. Together, these three nations created what became known as the EES, the Alliance of Sahel States. On paper, this might sound like just another regional grouping. In practice, it represented something far more significant. The first coordinated African response to the insurgency crisis in the region, entirely free from Western operational control. By 2023, the situation had evolved even further. Burkina Faso and Niger had also conducted military coups. Both countries had also moved to expel French forces. And critically, both had joined Mali's coalition. Now three of West Africa's most strategically important nations, with a combined population of roughly 80 million people, were operating under a unified military and political framework. They were no longer accepting Western military command structures. They were no longer deferring to international institutions that had consistently failed them. They were doing something radical, making their own decisions about their own security. But what was the actual military impact? That's the part that Western media has been almost entirely absent on. Consider what was happening on the ground. For years, insurgent groups, primarily affiliates of organizations like ISIS-affiliated ISIL-GS and Al-Qaeda-linked JNIM, had controlled vast swaths of territory across the Sahel. They collected taxes. They administered territory. They moved weapons and fighters with relative impunity. The international consensus was bleak. These groups were too distributed, too ideologically motivated, too well-funded to defeat through conventional military means. The best one could hope for was counterinsurgency, a euphemism that essentially meant indefinite military presence without any real expectation of victory. Then the AES took over security operations. What followed was a series of coordinated, large-scale military operations designed with a strategic objective that hadn't been seen in the region before, actually defeating these groups through sustained, coordinated offensive action. The AES forces, now equipped with new hardware and operating under unified command, began executing what can only be described as a comprehensive military campaign. They conducted strikes against insurgent strongholds. They eliminated key command nodes. They cut off supply lines. They retook strategic territory that had been under insurgent control for years. Take Labzanga, for example. This region in northern Mali had been a long-standing insurgent stronghold. The international consensus was that it was essentially held permanently by ISIL-GS. The resources required to retake it were considered prohibitively expensive in lives and material. So for years, it remained in insurgent hands. Then the Malian armed forces reorganized and refocused under the new political direction, launched a targeted operation. The result? They retook the area. It wasn't a minor tactical adjustment. It was a demonstration that the old assumptions about what could and couldn't be done were wrong. Kidal was another case study. This northern city had been contested territory for years, with significant insurgent presence. Multiple international counterinsurgency efforts had come and gone without dislodging them. The Malian military, with new capabilities and new strategic clarity, took control. These weren't symbolic victories. They were territorial reclamation that demonstrated the AES forces were actually capable of defeating, not just containing, the insurgent threat. But the most revealing part wasn't the large-scale operations. It was the methodology. The AES began employing sophisticated, modern tactics. Drone strikes against command centers. Precision-guided operations. Coordinated multi-theater operations using armored vehicle patrols and rapid response forces. Intelligence-driven targeting. The kind of operational sophistication that international analysts claimed these forces couldn't possibly achieve. Yet there it was, happening month after month, in increasing intensity and frequency. Here's what Western analysis got wrong. It assumed the problem was fundamentally about African military incompetence or insufficient Western training. In reality, the problem was different. It was strategic. Previous military operations had been constrained by a fundamental contradiction. Foreign militaries were present in these countries, but they weren't actually fighting for permanent victory, at least not openly. They were there for counterinsurgency, which by definition means indefinite military presence. A successful counterinsurgency campaign creates the conditions for withdrawal. That's not in the interest of a military power that benefits from maintaining a security presence in strategically important territory. Once that constraint was removed, once the forces operating were African forces fighting for African sovereignty in African territory, the strategy changed. The goal became actual victory. The tempo of operations increased. The intensity escalated. The sophistication improved. Within 2 years of this strategic reorientation, the situation had transformed so dramatically that it became impossible to ignore. But that's precisely when the media narrative shifted in a revealing way. Rather than accurately reporting the military successes, the dominant framing in international media became focused on concerns about authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, and human rights. Now, these are legitimate topics. Every military action deserves scrutiny, but the timing is worth noting. The same international institutions that had shrugged at the insurgent violence for nearly a decade became intensely focused on governance questions the moment African forces began winning without Western supervision. It's important to pause here and acknowledge something that complicates the narrative. This military success is real, but it exists alongside legitimate questions about governance and military rule. The AES nations are governed by military juntas, at least for now. They're not democracies in the traditional sense. These are facts that deserve serious consideration. But they're also being weaponized in the international discourse in a way that obscures the fundamental question: what is actually serving the interests of ordinary people in these regions? For a decade, these populations experienced the worst of both worlds. They had insurgent violence in their territories. They had foreign military presence that wasn't effectively stopping that violence. They had international attention that produced endless reports and commitments, but no actual security improvement. By every measure that matters, territory controlled by legitimate government forces, frequency of insurgent attacks, civilian casualties, the situation was getting worse, not better. Then, when African forces took matters into their own hands and began reversing that situation, the international response was to express concern about military rule. This reveals something crucial about the geopolitical dynamic at play. The issue isn't actually about governance or democracy. If it were, the international response would have been intense when these regions were drowning in insurgent violence and instability. The intensity arrived when African forces demonstrated they could win without asking permission. What happened next was perhaps the most revealing part of all. The Western powers and their allied international institutions began to impose consequences. France withdrew its military presence officially, but the diplomatic pressure intensified. There were threats of economic sanctions. International institutions began to suspend or restrict engagement. The message was unmistakable. If you reject our military presence and our strategic guidance, you will be isolated. But isolation is a threat that only works if the threatened nation has no alternatives. And here's what the Western response fatally miscalculated. The AES nations did have alternatives. Russia, which had been systematically building relationships across Africa for years, stepped in. Wagner Group contractors provided military training and support. Russian military equipment became available. Chinese manufacturers supplied drones and technology. The diversification of international partnerships meant that the threat of Western isolation, which had been effective for decades, suddenly became ineffective. The AES could weather Western pressure because they had secured other sources of support. This is the part of the story that fundamentally explains why what's happening in the Sahel represents such a dramatic geopolitical shift. It's not primarily about military tactics or counterinsurgency strategy, though those matter. It's about the breakdown of the Western monopoly on global power projection. For the post-Cold War era, Western nations and their allies had maintained something resembling global hegemony. If a country wanted military technology, training, or support, it primarily came from the West. If a country wanted development assistance, it came from Western-aligned institutions. If a country wanted diplomatic legitimacy, it came from Western recognition. That system is crumbling. Not everywhere, not simultaneously, but measurably and consistently. The Sahel is just the clearest example. What's particularly significant is that this shift is happening in Africa, the continent that most clearly exemplifies the legacy of colonialism and Western domination. For centuries, African nations had little choice in their international partnerships. European powers colonized the continent and extracted its resources. After independence, those same powers maintained influence through debt, conditional aid, and military presence. The idea that African nations could simply reject Western military presence, build their own security capabilities, form their own regional alliances, and turn to other international partners would have seemed impossible just decades ago. Yet it's happening, and it's happening in some of the continent's most strategically important locations. The implications extend far beyond the Sahel. If the AES model, coordinated regional security, rejection of foreign military bases, diversified international partnerships, proves successful, it becomes a template that other African nations might follow. And if African nations begin systematically reducing Western military presence and building continental security capacity, the entire architecture of global influence that has defined the international system for 75 years begins to fundamentally shift. This is why understanding what's actually happening in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger is crucial. These aren't just local conflicts. They're the leading edge of a broader transformation in how power is distributed globally. And they're happening with remarkably little Western awareness or understanding. The military operations themselves deserve deeper examination because they reveal something about the actual capabilities of African militaries when they're freed from the constraints of foreign command structures and given clear strategic objectives. The coordinated operations using drones, precision strikes, and sustained campaigns demonstrate something that contradicts decades of Western analysis. African forces, when properly organized and motivated, are quite capable of sophisticated military operations. The targeting of key insurgent leadership proved particularly effective. By identifying and eliminating command nodes, the EES disrupted insurgent command and control structures that had been operating with relative impunity for years. The degradation of insurgent leadership capacity then cascaded through these organizations, reducing their ability to conduct sophisticated operations. This is basic military doctrine, but its application in the Sahel was revolutionary because it represented a genuine commitment to victory rather than indefinite counterinsurgency. The recapture of infrastructure is equally revealing. Insurgent groups in the Sahel had developed sophisticated logistics networks, supply depots, training camps, communications infrastructure, weapon stockpiles. These have been allowed to exist openly for years, partly because the international counterinsurgency model doesn't prioritize their destruction. Once the AES took over, systematic targeting of this infrastructure began. Weapons depots were struck. Training camps were destroyed. Supply lines were cut. It's straightforward military strategy, but its execution revealed capabilities that previous analyses had underestimated. What's also important to acknowledge is the broader historical context that makes this moment so significant. The Sahel region sits at the intersection of multiple geopolitical interests. It borders the Atlantic and contains some of the world's most valuable mineral resources. It's adjacent to North Africa and the Mediterranean, which makes it strategically important for European security concerns. It sits between the Arab world and sub-Saharan Africa, making it culturally and religiously significant. It's the world's frontier for resource competition, rare earth minerals, oil, arable land, water access. For all these reasons, the Sahel has been subject to intense external interest and intervention. But the broader historical context is even more important. This is the first time in 5 centuries that West African nations have attempted to genuinely assert regional sovereignty over security matters without Western participation. That's a profound historical moment, regardless of the specific governance models being used. The language used by the EES leadership, references to sovereignty, to self-reliance, to resistance against neocolonialism, is not accidental. These leaders are explicitly positioning their actions within the history of African independence and the broader Pan-African movement. They're connecting what's happening in the Sahel to the decolonization struggles of the 1960s and the ongoing challenge of African nations fully controlling their own destinies. This isn't just military policy, it's a reassertion of historical agency. This positioning is particularly important because it connects to something that's been largely absent from Western discourse on Africa. The idea that Africans might want to control their own future, that they might have legitimate reasons to resent decades of military and economic dependency, and that they might be willing to accept difficult trade-offs, including military rule, for now, as the price of genuine sovereignty. Consider the fundamental choice facing these regions. They could accept continued Western military presence, continued dependence on Western training and equipment, continued influence of Western-aligned institutions in their policy decisions. In exchange, they'd get the promise of eventual democratic governance, economic development, and stability, promises that haven't materialized after 70 years of independence. Or they could pursue a different path, reject foreign military presence, build their own capabilities using whatever international partnerships prove available, accept military rule for a transition period, and attempt to establish a security foundation that actually serves their interests. One of these paths offers the promise of a better future, indefinitely deferred. The other offers immediate action and the possibility of genuine change, with significant uncertainty about the ultimate outcome. For the people living through daily insurgent violence and destabilization, the first path has already been tried and failed. The second path, however uncertain, at least offers the possibility of actual improvement. This is the calculation that the AES leadership is making, and it's a calculation that resonates with significant portions of their populations, particularly those who have experienced decades of failed counterinsurgency and still live under threat from insurgent groups. Public polling in these regions, when it's conducted, tends to show support for the military-led governments, not opposition. This suggests that the narrative framing in Western media, portraying military rule as a regression that populations oppose, doesn't align with expressed public sentiment in these regions. What happens next will be watched carefully by other African nations. If the AES military operations continue to succeed, if insurgent violence continues to decline, if regional security continues to improve, and if the military leadership can eventually transition towards civilian rule while maintaining sovereignty over foreign military presence, then the AES model becomes a serious alternative to the Western-led counterinsurgency approach that's dominated the past 2 decades. Conversely, if the military operations stall, if insurgent violence resurges, if international pressure and isolation begin to degrade capability, or if internal repression becomes severe enough to generate its own destabilization, then the Western position that these nations need external security partnerships might appear vindicated. The stakes are genuinely high because the outcome will influence how other African nations approach similar questions about military partnerships, sovereignty, and development. The implications extend beyond Africa. What's happening in the Sahel is part of a broader pattern visible across the global South. Nations are increasingly diversifying their international partnerships rather than remaining within traditional Western-aligned structures. This is evident in how nations vote at the United Nations, in arms purchases, in technology partnerships, in the formation of alternative economic institutions. The Sahel is simply the most dramatic example of this trend, partly because the stakes are highest and the contrast is sharpest. What this means for the future is genuinely uncertain. The outcome depends on multiple variables: whether the AES military operations can sustain momentum and actually defeat insurgent groups, whether international isolation and pressure can be weathered, whether military rule can eventually transition toward more representative governance, whether the cooperation among the 3 AES nations can be maintained given different national interests, and whether other African nations will follow this model or pursue different strategies. What's not uncertain is that we're witnessing a genuine shift in the distribution of power globally. Whether you view that shift positively or negatively likely depends on your perspective on Western military dominance, African sovereignty, and the institutions that have defined the international system for the past 75 years. But the shift itself is real, it's accelerating, and it's reshaping regions that are strategically vital to global security and economics. The story of the Sahel's military transformation is ultimately a story about power. Who has it, who wants it, and who's willing to fight for it. It's a story about whether the post-World War II international system can adapt to a multipolar world or whether it will fracture under pressure. It's a story about whether African nations can finally assert the sovereignty they nominally gained decades ago, or whether external influence will continue to constrain their choices. And it's a story that's far from over. What happens in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger over the next few years will reverberate across Africa and echo through the global order. The military operations will continue. The diplomatic pressure will continue. The fundamental question of who controls Africa's future will remain at stake. And increasingly, that question is being answered not by Western powers or international institutions, but by Africans themselves. That's what's actually happening in the Sahel. Whether the world is paying attention is another question entirely.